the breviary. God our Father, you called Francis Xavier Cabrini from Italy to serve the immigrants of America. By her example, teach us concern for the stranger, the sick, and the frustrated. Lord Jesus, you call everyone who does your will, your brother, sister, and mother. Help us to do what is pleasing to you in word and action. Now, last time I ended with the split in the church in 1054, and I wanted to say just a word about that before we begin, because I think it was a defining moment in a couple ways. For the first time officially, of course, the church was divided into two. We came to call one part Catholic, one part Orthodox. But it's going to have effects on this middle period that I call the adolescent period. For example, it is partly because of an attempt to reunite with the Orthodox that the popes were tempted, you might say, to engage in the Crusades. Theoretically, at first, it was a way to help the Byzantine Empire, and if we helped them, perhaps they'd reunite. And oddly enough, by the Fourth Crusade, we end up attacking them instead. And if you ever go to Venice, you'll find things that they looted from Constantinople. And that helped to solidify the split between the two churches. It also, there were times when they tried to undo it, the Council of Florence, and it just didn't work. But I thought that was a defining moment. And the excommunications from that time weren't lifted until 1964 by the Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI. So let's move into the period between that and the First Vatican Council. And Dave, if you could put up the slides.
Sure.
And all your smiling faces will disappear, Taryn. Okay, let's go to the beginning here. I want to give you an overview of this part about adolescence. And I'm going to try to show its effect on doctrine. You'll see in my definition of adolescence, there's a talk about adolescents taking risks, sometimes violent risks. And then new roles and responsibilities, new avenues and spiritualities, new lands, peoples, and customs coming in to the church. And I want to talk about some of the key moments from Council of Trent to Vatican I. So if we could go to the definition of adolescence. I'll point out first, of course, that I'm just making this artificial division. Even when we're in the adult period, you can always revert to your second childhood or adolescence or go on to senility. But adolescence is a period of dramatic physical change. That was true of the church. It grew tremendously in terms of geography. It is also a time of cognitive change as the adolescent begins to think of new possibilities and to consider abstract concepts such as love, fear, and freedom. Ironically, adolescents have a sense of invincibility that puts them at a greater risk of dying. A major developmental task during adolescence involves establishing one's own identity. New roles and responsibilities are explored. So if we can move to the first thing here, I want to talk about some of the cognitive change in what I call this period of adolescence. Now, we talked about in the early church, the church really had to get its sense of who it was and who Jesus was and who God was. Now they get a little more maybe sophisticated, or they are looking at things that are not quite as central in one sense. And one of those things, the next slide, would be concerns about the Eucharist. It wasn't that people didn't believe in the Eucharist before, it's just now they're starting to think about how we define what happens in the Eucharist. And in many cases in church history, you find that we only look at an issue when so-called heretics raise the question, and then the church has to come up with an answer. And there was a man named Berengarius around the year 1055 who had concerns about the Eucharist. And his doctrines basically were ended up being condemned by the church. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that for him, the body and blood of Christ are really present in the Eucharist, but it's an intellectual or spiritual presence. The substance of the bread and substance of the wine remain unchanged in their nature, but by consecration, they become spiritually the very body and blood of Christ. So it's a spiritual body and blood of Christ. And in some ways, it's very similar to some churches today, what they think of as the Eucharist as being more symbolic, real but symbolic, where the Catholic Church is going to come up with this idea of transubstantiation. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see, jumping ahead quite a bit, there are doctrinal challenges that come with the Protestant Reformation, which were jumped ahead here about 400 years. And if you look at the following slide, you'll see some of the main differences. Catholics believed in faith, sacraments, and good works, bringing salvation. Protestants, faith alone. Protestants believe in what they call the solas, the faith alone, scripture alone. The Bible is interpreted by each individual. The Catholics, the Bible is interpreted by the church. Priests are appointed by the church and cannot marry. We'll get to the cannot marry part in a bit. The priest of the believers is bigger with Protestants, and priests can, of course, marry, or priests or ministers. And then you have more elaborate services. We have a Mass and we have 7 sacraments. Many Protestant churches will say there are 2 sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper. So we begin to debate these issues, which are, some of them are more substantive than other. The elaborate nature of the Mass could be a matter of taste to some extent. How much incense, how much singing, how many statues, how much decoration. Other things are more central, like our beliefs and salvation. So in this adolescent period, the church has to struggle with these new challenges that they hadn't perhaps fully had to deal with before. Other things begin to happen as we look at the way the church is situated in the world. If we go to the next one, you have a restructuring that goes on into the church. The Lateran Council of 1059 put out new legislation regarding papal elections, and they entrusted voting for the Pope to the Roman cardinals. You may know that in the early church, congregations chose their bishops. The Pope was chosen often by the people of Rome, or at least the clergy and people of Rome. And the church was sometimes having problems because of local politicians getting involved and things like that. So it's decided to create what today we would call the College of Cardinals. And so from that point on, you begin to see the church choosing its top leader with the cardinals doing it. And then we had some state church issues. The next one, during the pontificate of Gregory VII, who had been a monk named Hildebrand, there was a lot of reform that went on. And basically where it ran into problem with the state was that Henry IV and other emperors were investing people to make them bishops. As I said to my students, it would be as though Donald Trump or Kathy Hochul got to appoint the Bishop of Albany. And the Pope, of course, is fighting over that. The Emperor's fighting. The Emperor feels he's also been chosen by God. Who gets to pick somebody for a higher rank? The bishops often were also the only people who were really scholars, could read and write. They were primary advisors to people like emperors and kings. But the Pope said, no, the bishop can only receive his authority from the church. And eventually, they're going to compromise on this. But this is going to be the beginning, you might say, of struggles of church versus state. So to move ahead, you have another crisis for the church in the 1300s, the Avignon papacy and another schism. And this is a really strange one in a sense. And it helps pave the way for the Protestant Reformation. You may remember that there was a struggle between the Pope and the French king. And at a certain point, the king manages to move the papacy to Avignon in France. That's why you can buy Chateau Neuf du Pape to drink. And the French cardinals always favored this, and the Italian cardinals favored keeping the papacy in Rome, which was important because the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. But for about 70 years, the church moved its headquarters to Avignon in France. Sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the church, because like the captivity of the Jews in Babylon, it lasted about 70 years. And if you go to the next slide, you can see pictures of some of the Avignon popes. Now, subsequently, the Catholic Church declared some of these people to be anti-popes and not popes at all. One of them was John the 23rd. So in the 1960s, John the 23rd became the second John the 23rd. It was a way of saying this first one wasn't a real pope at all. And finally, they returned to Italy, and they elected an Italian, and then they got into a big argument. A lot of the cardinals said our vote was coerced. They moved out of Rome, elected another pope, so you had two popes. And then trying to solve that problem, they said, both of you are out, we're going to have a third pope, and a church council will look at things. And they end up with three popes. And different countries sided with different popes, and it was a real mess. Finally, they agreed on one pope, Pope Martin, exactly almost 100 years before the Protestant Reformation. So while the church was in Europe was going through a lot of difficulties, like the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, different countries favored different popes, different saints favored different popes. Who was the real pope? No one knew for sure. In the end, one pope wouldn't step down and everybody ignored him, and he excommunicated the world every day from his balcony, supposedly. But they decided on a common pope and ended the schism. But it really undermined the authority of the church at a delicate time. So to go to another part of adolescence that sometimes plays into this, if we go to the next slide, this idea that adolescents have a sense of invincibility that puts them at a greater risk of dying. And you have to look at things like the Crusades. Now, I mentioned one reason for the Crusades. There's a couple reasons, really, a number of reasons. One was it might be a way to help the Byzantine emperor, and then maybe they'll come back to the union with the Roman Church. Another one was the Muslims who had taken over more recently had prevented Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Before that, Christians were allowed to come and go. And now one of them comes in and says, no more Christians coming into Jerusalem. And you can imagine the Catholics and the Christians were not happy about that. Some people cynically say that what they're trying to do is keep the young adolescent men who would be what we might call juvenile delinquents, keep them occupied by giving them someplace to fight far away from home. In any event, these crusades take place. On the way to the Holy Land, many of them said, what are we going all the way here for? To attack the infidels? Let's kill Jews. And there's a very anti-Jewish side to this. And there was 8 crusades in all, and it was very, turned out to be probably, in many ways, a great horror that has harmed relationships to this day between Muslims and Catholics, but also between Catholics and Orthodox. And if you go to the next slide, you see how the Crusaders, for a while, were successful, and they set up kingdoms in the Middle East. You can still go there and see castles and things like that were built by Crusaders coming from places like France or Germany or places like that. But in the end, the Christians are driven out, and this becomes a Muslim area again, primarily. So you have this sense of violence, and it's exhibited also in the next pope here, the next slide, Julius II. The popes by this time were temporal rulers. They had armies, they had a state, and this one was called the warrior pope. They claimed he loved fighting, he loved being in battle. I think he fought himself in some of the battles. And if you look at the next slide, there's even speculated that he took his name as pope, not in honor of Pope Julius I, but Julius Caesar. And he saw himself maybe more as a temporal ruler. I think that's going to be important when we get to the end of this night, when I talk about the next step. The next slide, you see more about this. There's a policy during his time, during the so-called Italian Wars, the papal states increased their power and centralization, and the papacy is crucial diplomatic and politically in Italy and Europe in the 16th century. So you have a pope who's also a war leader. So it's some of this, what I would say, the adolescent violence. And a number of wars occurred that are just horrific from a religious point of view or any other point of view. If you look at the next one, you have the wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation, basically from 1524 to 1648. And Dave and I were talking about this last night. And what's astounding about this are the casualty figures. If you go to the next slide, you can see the total death toll is estimated to be between 5.5 million and 18.5 million people. Some people say more like 7 to 10. And it had different facets to it. There were French wars of religion within France, 30 Years' War. It wasn't always religion, like France sometimes fought on the Protestant side, but it really turned a lot of people off toward religion in general, because they, basically said a plague on both your houses. What does this have to do with Christ, the Prince of Peace, that we have all this killing and these major conflicts? And in some ways, this maybe helped to bring in some of the more secular thinking that's going to come around with the Age of Enlightenment. And you go to the next slide, it also shows these death figures are direct combat, massacres, famine, disease. And so there's widespread conflict and societal disruption until 1648. They agree to make a compromise and ends the wars of religion for the most part. So what else is going on? And down here we see that as in an adolescent youth, people take on new roles and responsibilities. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the things that were changed during this time. And the first one here, the next slide, is at the Second Lateran Council in 1139, the church brought in the rule that all priests had to remain celibate. Sometimes my students are surprised to hear that priests at one time could marry. In many ways, in parts of the Catholic Church, like the Eastern Rites, that's still the case. And in many cases, like in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you have the celibate clergy who are just the monks, and from them that the bishops come. But the other priests, the village priest, the parish priest, was often married. And some people say the real reason for this was that priests were taking church property and leaving it to their children. And so to get it out of the hands of particular families, the church enforced the celibacy requirement. You can argue that maybe that's a cynical view, but this is sort of the period when, after 1139, celibacy for priests becomes mandatory. It was always the case for monks and nuns, but now it's being enforced for everybody who receives holy orders. It's one of the reasons I think that today, in terms of things that we talk about changing, it's a lot easier to deal with than, say, the ordination of women, because there's no theological objection, and for 1,000 years we did it. And remember, Peter had a mother-in-law. So there can be reasons why I wouldn't be surprised if at some point diocesan clergy were allowed to marry. Another big change in the church occurs regarding women, and I want to spend a little time on this. If we go to the next slide, there's a lot of new paths for women religious. And I want to mention these women because in many ways they're the heart and soul of this period of time. If you remember, because of the society they were in, many women didn't have much ability to do anything outside the home. They didn't have an ability to have an education sometimes. If they were married to a king or a prince, maybe they had a little more power. But one avenue that they could take to give some meaning and some substance to their life was by entering a convent. And although they were often still cloistered, you began to see some of them becoming very powerful people. And I want to mention a few of them, starting with St. Clare in the next, let's start with Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen has become very popular lately. She was born in Germany in 1098, and she founded an abbey, but she was more than just a nun. She was an expert in natural science, herbs and curative things. She was a mystic. She was a musician who wrote music, which is still performed today. She was known to people all over the place. She got into doctrinal discussions with rulers and even with popes who went to her for advice. She's very, very well known as a mystic, and just recently was not only canonized, but I think declared a doctor of the church. So she's very prominent in the Middle Ages. And then shortly after this, when we have St. Clare. Many of you who are connected with Franciscans know about Clare. But one thing she did that was new, she was forced, you might say, to have a cloistered life, but she insisted as a Franciscan on living poverty. And they thought that was impossible, especially for women, that they had to rely on rich benefactors and estates and things like that. And she insisted on using her own rule that she wrote. And she argued about this with the Pope until she was on her deathbed. And the Pope finally said, okay, you win. She wrote the first rule for women, and he accepted it. But he only accepted it for her monastery in Assisi, but later on spread to others. But she got her way, and she did it very politely, but determinedly. She was going to stand up for what she thought was the proper way to be a Franciscan woman. And so she's very noted for that. She also was from the upper classes, and she is known for some of her writings. And when the Franciscan world, we say, St. Francis was probably a little bit of a wild man, and St. Clare was the one who held things together, especially because after he died, they would often come to her for advice. Um, I'm going to not say much about Bridget. Elizabeth of Hungary is another one. She enters the Franciscan movement, but she does it as a lay person. She's a patron saint of the secular Franciscans. She married a ruler. She was from Hungary, but she married a German ruler in Thuringia. And she, as you see here, was always helping the poor. She started a hospital. She would always sneaking food out to feed the poor. And her husband would ask her about it. And one story was miraculously the food turned into flowers, but mostly he supported her. But then he died, and they were both only in their early 20s. And she went on to work and start a hospital and to work with the poor as an aristocratic woman. And she becomes prominent among secular Franciscans to this day. And then we have Bridget of Sweden. I don't have too much on her, except you may have heard the Bridgetine sisters. They wear the thing that goes across the top of their head like a cross. And I actually saw some in Estonia one day, and I thought it was like something out of the pages of history. But I don't know too much about her, so I can't really say much. But she was a prominent person in Scandinavia in the 1300s. The next woman, Julian of Norwich, is very well known. Funny thing about her was they don't know really what her name was. She was called an anchoress, meant she lived sort of locked up in a little place like you see here. And it was St. Julian's, which gave her the name. And Julian of Norwich was an English person of the Middle Ages, and she had a series of visions, or what she called showings, about the Passion of Christ. And her writings became known as the Revelations of Divine Love. They're thought to be the oldest surviving English language work by a woman. And although she was sort of connected to this church physically almost, people would come to see her all the time for advice. And if you haven't read her writing, it's really beautiful and it's very optimistic. She's the one that says, all will be well. And yeah, there's this, there's that, there's purgatory, there's hell. But in the end, everything's going to be okay. And she's not actually a canonized saint, but she's held in great reverence. The Vatican has her in documents. She's highly thought of in the Church of England, of course, among the Lutheran Church. And is one of the great spiritual writers of the Middle Ages. And I mentioned again that to be able to read and write at that level in the Middle Ages was amazing for men and women. But for women, a path to this was to go into religious life and become, particularly if you became an abbess. The next one is Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc is kind of an interesting case. You may know what happened to her. She felt she was called by the voice of St. Michael the Archangel to intensify her Christian life, but to commit herself to the liberation of France. So as a teenage girl, she's leading armies. Then she's accused of being a witch and a heretic and wearing men's clothes. And she's burned at the stake by the English and the Burgundians after a church trial. And then later on, the church says, oops, we made a mistake. And in 1920, she's canonized as a saint. During World War I, French soldiers always carried little pictures of Joan of Arc. And so you can debate whether she's a patriotic leader or a religious leader, but she seemed to be a person who held to her conscience no matter what, even when it cost her life. And she believed that she was being inspired by God. And she was, again, another person carried along on this mystical route. The next person is Catherine of Siena. Catherine was what today we'd call third order Dominican. She was, the reason I think she entered religious life is she was the youngest of 26 children. It was a huge family. And if you go to Siena, Italy, you can see where the family lived. But Catherine was a very, not only vibrant woman, but a mystical woman, but also one who's not afraid to do battle with everyone, including the Pope. And she's the one during the Avignon papacy, she said to the Pope, you've been chosen by God, get yourself back here or give up the papacy, is basically what she told him. And she kept harassing him and cajoling him. And the Pope finally returned to Rome, which was what she felt that God had called her to work on. So she became a very, very powerful woman in her day. She had no problem with telling people what she thought was the right thing to do. And today, often the Dominicans will refer to her as one of the two most important people after St. Dominic. She becomes, they're separated by centuries. And if you go to a Siena today, and you talk about our own patron, St. Bernardine of Siena, they may not have heard of him, but they all know St. Catherine. I'd remember somebody too if there were 26 children. This woman, Caritas Perkheimer, is little known, I think. She was a Poor Clare abbess who lived in Germany at the time of the Reformation. And Caritas was a very scholarly woman. She was sought after by people, the sorts of people like Erasmus or people like that. She was a theologian. She could hold her own against any of the great thinkers of the Protestant Reformation or the Catholic Church. And it came a point where the town went Protestant. And they said, okay, Caritas, it's time to shut down your monastery. And she refused. And they said, you got to convert to Protestantism. And she refused. And so bit by bit, they did everything they could to starve the nuns out. It wouldn't let them take new members. Eventually, they did die out. But she kept them going for about 10, 12, 15 years and refused to capitulate, even though she sometimes might have agreed with some of the Protestant beliefs, but she was not willing to give up her Catholicism or her role as a Poor Clare, and became a very well-known dissident, you might say. Teresa of Avila, probably the most famous mystic in the church, reformed the Carmelite order, worked together with St. John of the Cross to try to also reform the men branch of the Carmelites, wrote mystical writings that sometimes got her checked out by the Inquisition. She may have been partly of Jewish descent, which was suspicious at that time, but she probably goes down as maybe the most famous mystic in the Catholic Church ever. And so she is probably one of the best known women and really in the beginning of the early modern period. And then we have a fun person, Maria de Agreda, the woman in blue, or the lady in blue. Maria was a mystic, and she lived in Spain, and she wrote what she said was a biography of the Virgin Mary, and she said it was revealed to her by Mary herself, and she was just taking notes. And that would have been interesting enough. She got investigated by the Spanish Inquisition, but she ended up becoming friends with the king, and they wrote back and forth for like 40 years. And then one day in Texas, of all places, some native people came to the Franciscan friars and said, you've got to send missionaries to us. And the friars said, we don't have the manpower. We can't do it right now. And they said, well, no, you have to. And he said, why are you so insistent? He said, a lady in blue has been teaching us. And she said, go get the friars to come here. And it turned out that one of the Indian people in the room saw a picture of a nun. And he said, that's her in the blue habit. And the belief grew that she was bilocating, that without leaving Spain, she was doing missionary work in the American Southwest. And there's an interesting book about that. And they went and questioned her. They said, did you really go to New Mexico and Arizona and Texas? And she sort of said, well, yeah. And then, but I didn't leave here. And then later on, she sort of didn't emphasize that so much. So it became kind of ambiguous. But I think she's interesting because when you study the Southwest of the United States, she becomes kind of famous, especially in Texas, as the lady in blue who was evangelizing among indigenous people. The next one I put on because she's related to me. Marguerite Bourgeois was up in Canada. She came from France at the very beginning of Montreal. And she arranged for the restoration of the big cross that you may see, which on Mount Royal. That's not the same one. I don't think it had been destroyed. She constructed a chapel, Notre Dame de Bon Secours, which is still there. She was convinced of the importance of the family, and she saw the role exercised by women to be important. So she helped women who were preparing for marriage. And then she had a stable given her by the governor, and she opened the first school in Montreal, and she organized a congregation. She went back and forth to Europe several times. She believed in instructing kids who were both French and indigenous women, young women, children. And she became very well known and was considered almost a founder. She was called a mother in the colony. And I like to mention her because I'm a descendant of her sister. So she's my 9 times great aunt. And I went up to Montreal and I saw the church that she helped found, and she's buried there. And they had a funeral, and they said, "Well, you can't go in right now." And then they found out I was a relative, and they let me right in, and they wanted to show me everything. And they unlocked the doors under the church and had an architect show me around. And they kept saying, "Well, your Aunt Marge this and your Aunt Marge that." And some of the nuns up there met one of the friars, and they would say, "Aunt Marge sends him this," and they send me a statue of her, a relic of her. So I always like to think of her as a founder of education in Canada, founder of Montreal, but also my great 9 times great aunt. So that's Aunt Marge. And the American version maybe is Elizabeth Ann Seton, who, as you know, I think was the first or second American citizen. I think Frances Cabrini was the first citizen. She was the first born here, but was Episcopalian and converted to Catholicism and started an order of sisters. And many of the different orders trace themselves back to Elizabeth Ann Seton. She's buried in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And so she becomes prominent in the United States, lived in New York City for a while, but spent some time in Italy, where she basically got her idea of becoming a Catholic. And then as you get in the 19th century, you have Catherine Labouré, who, as you can see by her outfit, was what we used to call God's geese, with that hat that she's got on. Catherine Labouré wouldn't have been known really much. She worked with the elderly, and she's a patron saint of the elderly, so I'm getting to like her a lot better. The sick and the disabled. She died in 1876, and she's one of these people with an incorruptible body. You can see her lying there in Paris. But she also is most famous because she came up and said that it was shown her by Mary with the miraculous medal. And you can see a picture of the miraculous medal there. And so she's remembered for that primarily. And this is a kind of a 19th century phenomenon where the church is kind of in recovery from the French Revolution. And finally, you have the last person I want to mention here is Bernadette Soubirous, Saint Bernadette, who's the one who who saw the Virgin Mary at Lourdes, and another one whose body is practically incorrupt, but they think they touch her up a little bit. But she insisted that the Virgin Mary told her to dig in the water, and the water flowed out of the ground, and people still go there for healing. And so again, and when she asked Mary who she was, Mary said, "I am the Immaculate Conception," which grammatically doesn't make sense, but it was at the time when the Immaculate Conception was just being defined as a doctrine. And so Bernadette was a part of that. Okay, if we move on from there, other new avenues of spirituality, we talked about the women, but there are other things going on in religious orders. And I'll just quickly mention them. The first one here in the next slide is St. Bruno. Bruno founded the Carthusians, and all these orders generally start out as Benedictines or people who just wanted to be left alone and go off and find God. And they would go off in the wilderness, sometimes without thinking of founding an order, but they end up founding one. The next one is St. Robert, who founded the Cistercians. You may know the Cistercians are the strict observance, who come to be called Trappists. And they were well known in the United States for Thomas Merton, but also because they were famous for not speaking much. And their main monastery in the United States was the Trappist Monastery in Bardstown, Kentucky. But again, it's an attempt to reform the Benedictine order to bring it back to its simple structure. Another one that shows up around the same time as St. Bernard, who established the Abbey of Clairvaux, and he also helped to bring about the Cistercian reform. And then lesser known is this next man, St. Norbert, who established a monastery of people called Premonstratensians or Norbertines. Now, why I'm showing all these is they all seem to be about the 1100s, and they're showing a need within the church for reform and renewal within monasticism. And at the end of this time, you have the beginning of what are called the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and to some extent the Carmelites. So if you go to the next one, you'll see verbal approval was given by Pope Innocent III to a rule of life for the Order of Friars Minors started by St. Francis of Assisi. Now, I'm just going to focus on a couple things about the Franciscans and Dominicans. You have to picture the church in the Middle Ages. By this time, The average person didn't understand Latin. If you go to Mass, even now in some churches, they ring the little bells at the consecration. That was probably because people were doing things like selling chickens in the back of the church, talking to their neighbors, not paying much attention. And they said, this is the important part. They'd ring the bells, everybody would look at the host. And they had some certain superstitions, like as long as you were looking at the host, you wouldn't age. So some people followed the Eucharist around from church to church, so they wouldn't get older. And maybe it did help with physical fitness to do all that traveling. But the friars, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, both said people are losing touch with their faith. They're not understanding it. The clergy was often very ignorant. Until the Lateran Council, if somebody wanted to be a priest, he went to priests and said, I want to be a priest. And the priest said, follow me around for a while and do what I do. And he'd say, go into Mass and you say, ad introibo auditari Dei. And the priest, the young guy, would say, what does that mean? He said, never mind, just repeat it. And then when he thought he was ready, he'd say, the bishop ordained this guy as a priest. So you had a lot of the clergy that were not well educated. You had scandals in the church, which is a perennial thing going on. And the people who probably were the most observant and religious and educated were the monks, but the monks stayed in their monasteries. So into this world comes St. Francis and St. Dominic. And one of the things they both do is they first of all emphasize the human life of Jesus, particularly the Franciscans. We always say Jesus is divine and human, 100% each, but we tend to emphasize one or the other. And the pendulum had swung way over to the divine. So that in the Middle Ages, almost all the cathedrals are called Notre Dame, Our Lady of this, Our Lady of that. They were afraid of Jesus, and Mary was going to intercede. Well, Francis starts to emphasize the humanity of Christ by focusing on two things: the incarnation, his birth, and his passion and death. And so the Franciscans promote the Christmas crutch that we all have at Christmas. Now, whether they actually invented it, Francis reenacted the first Christmas at Mass one time, and this became a popular devotion that you see even now in homes. Even if they're not Catholic, they may have a little crib with Mary and Joseph and the baby. The other thing on the other end of Jesus' life, the next slide, is the Stations of the Cross. Now, remember, the Crusades are going on. Some of the saints, like Bernard of Clairvaux, are calling for everybody to go fight in the Crusades. Francis goes to Egypt and ends up talking with the Muslims and borrows some ideas from them. One idea he may have borrowed, the prayer is called the Angelus, because the Muslims would pray 5 times a day. And he said, let's ring bells at 6 noon and 6 p.m. And we have prayers where the angel of the Lord declared unto Mary. That may have started with the Muslims. And he also wrote the Praises of God, which is very similar to the 100 names of Allah that the Muslims had. But the Franciscans also said, because of the war and the fighting, we're all getting killed so we can go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. You don't have to go there physically. In your own church, you can have these Stations of the Cross, or in a garden or wherever. And so up until the 1960s, I think, every Catholic church would have the Stations of the Cross, and you always had to invite Franciscans in to erect the stations and to make them official in your church. So it was a way in which the Franciscans gave people something tangible that connect them to their faith when they weren't understanding Latin or maybe theology. The Dominicans, the next slide, around the same time with St. Dominic, promote the rosary. There were rosaries before. There's a Franciscan type of rosary, but the Dominicans really were the ones who make this a very, very popular devotion. So much so that that's what people were often doing during Mass. Even when I was a boy, they're not really paying attention to Mass because in those days they didn't know what was going on, so they just said the rosary. And the rosary is still a very powerful and well-known prayer, but the Dominicans were the ones who really promoted it. And finally, there's one other group of friars, the Carmelites, and we talked about St. Teresa reforming them. But all these groups were called friars because they didn't stay home like the monks, but they weren't assigned to city parishes like the diocesan clergy. They weren't directly under a bishop. And they had all this manpower that was available when it came time for people to go on missions to the Mongols, or most importantly, later on when the New World opens up, all the early missionaries are almost all Franciscans, Dominicans, and later Jesuits. Now, During this time, you have the next slide, we have a very important Pope, Innocent III, probably considered one of the most powerful popes ever. And he calls the Fourth Lateran Council. And one of the things that council did was said, no new religious orders. There's too many of them. People are getting confused. You can't form any more religious orders. The Franciscans got in under the wire. The Dominicans kind of snuck in, but had to adopt a rule that was based on the Augustinian rule. And that meant that when people showed up later, they couldn't call themselves orders. And a good example comes, I think, next, when you have the start of the Jesuits in 1540. It's not the Jesuit order, it's the Company of Jesus. It was a military model, or the Society of Jesus. And you'll notice when orders come from different time periods, they tend to have a different feel to them. For example, among Dominicans and Franciscans, women are an important part of the movement of the family. In fact, Dominic at first had trouble finding men, and women were opening up their convents to him. With the Jesuits, there's no female Jesuits. Later on, there are women's groups that are inspired by the Jesuits, but that's because they saw themselves as almost a military order, a company of Jesus. And but they couldn't take the name of order because no new orders were to be allowed. So that's why they're called the Society of Jesus. Okay, so you got all these new orders, and then the next thing I want to look at is new lands, peoples, and cultures coming into the church. During this period, you have a massive expansion of the church away from the old boundaries of the Roman Empire. Before this, the church only went out like maybe to Ireland and someplace on the edge like Armenia, but maybe a few of them got to India. But now you see a massive movement of missionaries going out into the whole world. And many of them are these Franciscan and Dominicans who are joining in great numbers, and they're not tied down to a parish, and they're not locked up in a monastery, so they're free to do all sorts of things. And they're the ones usually sent on the missions. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see during this age, there were a number of missions in the Americas and other colonies, not only Franciscans and Dominicans, but also Augustinians. And they spread Catholicism in the New World and convert many of the indigenous people, millions of the indigenous people, sometimes controversially. But you notice here on the left is Junipero Serra. Then you have St. Francis Solano, who went to South America and would sometimes, they said, enchant the Indians by playing the violin. Then you had Bartolomeo de las Casas, a Dominican who fought for the rights of the Indians who were being abused. And on the far right, you have Pedro de Gante, a Franciscan who he appears in our chapel downstairs here. He lived to be about 90 years old and was thought to be the illegitimate child of the Holy Roman Emperor. Whether that's true or not, he came from Belgium, but in Spanish territory. And he started some of the first schools in the New World. And so in Mexico, you often find a Pedro de Gante elementary school, not necessarily even religious. In the late 1400s, Portuguese traders and missionaries began to arrive in West Africa, Guinea, Mauritania, Gambia, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. And there was a kingdom of the Congo where they had a lot of success. The king and many of the leading people converted to Catholicism. Unfortunately, in many cases, all this gets destroyed when slave traders start to move in on these territories. And the next one just shows a Franciscan, probably a Capuchin Franciscan in Africa. You can find works of art like the one on the left, the crucifix on the left, that were done in different metals, whatever, that were made in West Africa by these indigenous Catholics. And then the next one down, you see, again, another picture of a priest, probably a friar, with people in Africa. The most famous missionary, probably one person, is this one, Francis Xavier, who starts an 11-year career as a missionary from India to Japan, wanted to go to China, but died off the coast, a Jesuit. And he's really the vanguard. He's an early Jesuit. He knew Ignatius himself, and he is buried in Goa, which is today part of India. But he introduced Catholicism to a lot of people in places like, for example, the Philippines. He would have been important. And then I jump ahead to one last guy who's really later on, the end of this period and into the modern period, Charles de Foucauld, who was a French army officer who thought he should live like Jesus, went to the Holy Land, lived in Bethlehem for a while, did tasks around monasteries. and then moved out into the desert to live among the Muslims in North Africa. And he lived a very simple life, building friendship with Muslims and Berber tribesmen, and eventually was murdered in 1916. And finally, I returned to two people that you would know pretty well. Kadri Tekakwitha, who lived in this area, the first canonized North American or United States of America saint from the indigenous people, and Nicholas Black Elk, an interesting guy because I read his book years ago, Black Elk Speaks. And in the book, they talk about him being a Lakota or a Sioux holy man, but they don't mention that he went on to become a catechist and a Catholic, and he's now up for canonization. So he may be canonized in the next couple of years, and he'd be the second Native American from the United States to be canonized as a saint. Okay, now, what's going on during this whole period from Council of Trent to Vatican I? So let's go to the next slide, and you see what's called the Counter-Reformation. In many ways, the church I grew up in was a church still living out of the Council of Trent. A lot of things were done then that have an effect even to today, but particularly before Vatican II. The next slide shows one of them. We have to educate our people going into the priesthood. And so they established seminaries. As I said before, you just hung on to somebody who was a priest and they taught you what to do. Now you have training and educating and you learn theology and you learn how to do the sacraments and all that. So for the first time, you have an educated priesthood to the point where today you practically, in most countries, you need at least a master's degree to be ordained. And then the next slide, you also have reforms to address corruption and abuses. One of the ones that the Protestants had rightly complained about was the sale of indulgences. They didn't do away with indulgences, but they did away with the sale of indulgences. And so they began to try to respond in some ways to the Protestants. The next one is an interesting one, marriage. Now, marriage, as you may know, is based on the ministers being the husband and wife. The priest is not the minister. It's the reason why when I do a wedding, I'm doing one this weekend, I never say, I now pronounce you man and wife, like in the movie version, because they are declaring themselves husband and wife. And there was a period of time in which the church wasn't directly really involved in marriage too much. You would get married however you got married, and then you'd go to the priest and get a blessing. But what happened was guys were seducing women saying, please marry me. And he'd sleep with her that night and then disappear. And so they said, in order to be really married, you have to get married in front of a priest and two witnesses. And that's sort of how we got to the modern way of doing weddings. And this was made kind of legal by the Council of Trent. Okay, then what I would say next is the low point for the church, probably in all of history, the French Revolution. And I know we're going through hundreds of years, like rapidly, but it's the nature of the beast, I guess. If we go to the next slide, we can see that this was a period where the papacy almost got extinguished. This man here on this is a book cover is Pius VII, who was basically kidnapped by Napoleon and taken to France. And you have the growth of modern nations who are insisting that they have control of church in their country, kind of like Henry VIII had before in England. But they said, we're going to be Catholic, but we're going to be French Catholic or Austrian Catholic. We're getting rid of religious orders. And of course, that's happening in Protestant countries. But the French Revolution was a disaster because the church never recovered in the sense of, for example, religious orders, the number of members they had. Now, it wasn't all bad, but for the most part, it was really difficult for Catholics in particular, but Christians in general, when the French Revolution came. If we go to the next slide. And this was this is a famous scene. You may have seen the musical thing about the death of the Carmelites while these nuns were beheaded by the guillotine. And where the French Revolution went to the extreme of not only trying to reform the church, but basically adopting paganism at a certain point. And then the next thing you see is a point that I think is important. During the church's long 19th century, which lasted into the 1950s, the church was suffering and manifesting the symptoms akin to an institutional version of post-traumatic stress disorder. If you look at some of the stuff the church did in the 19th century, they're reacting, the church is reacting, and by the church here, I mean the institution is reacting kind of on the defensive. And so you get you see this Batman figure slapping Robin, whoever that is. Um, you get things like the syllabus of error that says the Pope is not subject to anyone. The Pope just shouldn't believe in democracy. The church shouldn't believe in democracy. The modern world is dangerous. You don't want things like evolution, and all this sort of stuff. Because the church is feeling under attack, and it takes a long time to move out from this. And some of the ways it moves out is on the spiritual level and some on a more political level. So in the next one, you see a key doctrinal point in 1854 is the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. If nothing else, it kind of showed that the church was still alive, and that there was still a devotion within the church, and there was something of a recovery. And then the next slide, you see the thing I want to end with, really, Vatican I. The First Vatican Council, I think, is a significant turning point because it marks the high point in some ways for the papacy, and it marks the beginning of the end of the Pope's temporal powers. So the Pope comes in, they declare infallibility. The only time it's ever used is the next slide in 1950s when the Assumption of Mary was made a doctrine. But in 1870, the Council declares papal infallibility. Now, it's often misunderstood. It doesn't mean the Pope can say anything, and it's true. The Pope has to be expressing the belief of the Church. It has to be a matter of faith or morals. He has to know he's doing it this way. But just as the Council is defining this, sort of the high point of papal power, the French pull their army out, the Italians take over, and they lock up the Pope, and he becomes the prisoner of the Vatican. And the church then is basically left powerless in terms of political power. And so you have the capture of Rome on September 20th, 1870. And they say that when the papal infallibility was made a doctrine, there was a big lightning and thunderstorm. I don't know if that's true. And you had this thing that was going on called ultramontanism. Let's all turn to Rome and look beyond the mountains to Rome. And people became obsessed almost with the Pope. If you think about earlier centuries, people knew there was a Pope. He might say something that 20 years down the road might affect you, but there are no cameras, no television, no internet. Nobody really knew what the Pope looked like most of the time. The Pope could die and you wouldn't know about it for years. So it wasn't that the Pope wasn't important, but it was in the early 20th century, you get a thing where some people almost seem to worship the Pope more than Christ or God. So then you move to the next slide. And this is one of the great ironies of history. The church almost dies in the 19th century, but as an organization, it loses its power as a leader. The Pope today is technically a head of state, but it's kind of a fiction in a way. But the church becomes more united and monolithic, still very cautious about everything. But I think at least in terms of popes, in the 20th century, they're forced almost to become spiritual leaders because they're involved with diplomacy and things like that, but they no longer are rulers. And so you have this monarchical papacy, which is sort of forced to come to an end to some extent. They try to carry on. And I think it's the final slide, the next one. One thing they did that is an item of controversy is there was a doctrine called Pastor Aeternus. It said the Pope is the immediate and ordinary pastor of the whole church. Now, this is something in a way that's new. Remember, in the early church, you would choose your own bishops. The church would go on in your diocese as the church. You wouldn't have any involvement with Rome unless there was a real controversy. You had to get some outside opinion on things. But now the Pope, for example, can decide who's going to be the Bishop of Albany. There's an immediate jurisdiction that you wouldn't have had in earlier centuries. There's been a movement, as we'll talk about next time, from the Second Vatican Council to return more to subsidiarity, where things are handled on the local level, where the Pope is, especially in light of his talking with the Orthodox, who we started with, this idea of universal jurisdiction is a problem for them. They see the Pope as the first among equals, among the patriarchs of the church. And so you see some of the popes recently saying let's redefine what it means to be pope. Let's go to a system that is perhaps more synodal, and you have the synodal process, which is involved listening to other people more. And maybe you also have, as we'll talk about next time, movements toward ecumenism and interfaith dialogue, things that you wouldn't have thought of in the 19th century. But I think a turning point was the First Vatican Council, which forced really a change in the way the church did business. And again, I'm always talking mostly about the institutional church, because obviously the faith of the average person is not always dependent on what some priest or bishop thinks, or even a pope. So I'll stop there with some questions, maybe.
Okay, if someone would like to question, comment, or anything.
Again, I'm sorry to go so fast, but it's hard to cover up centuries.
Okay.
I have a question. This is Mike Hanukkah from Christ Our Light.
Yeah.
So I actually did see you at Mass over there.
You did?
Yeah. So my question is, of course, some of these things I want to go into a little deeper to, and my first impulse is just to Google it and get an AI answer. Do you have any other go-to historical reference online?
Well, of course, in all of these things, there are books and things, but that would take a long time to do that. But I would say there's a couple things you can do. What I would do is Google and get multiple sources and try to pay attention to where it's coming from.
Okay.
One place that sometimes can help with history, like when I was looking up some of these women's saints, I looked at the Vatican website, and there was actually little biographies of them, there's also all the papal encyclicals for the last 100 years are on the Vatican website. You can read them for yourself. And so that's a good resource. There are histories of the church. Some of them are better than others. One I remember for some reason, but I think it was easy to read, and I may have used it in grad school, was Thomas, I think it's Bocotan or something like that. Just a history of the church. And then there's a guy named, I think, J. Dolan, who wrote a history of the church in the United States, which is his own separate little thing. So I would say try to look at a few sources, and if something sounds a little dramatic, check another source and see what they say.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Other questions, comments at this point? Yes, Kathleen?
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm a Catholic high girl, and we were crusaders. And the older I got, I'm like, why in the world would you pick that name as a mascot if you know the history of the Crusades? That's one thought. And my other thought / question, I'm the rabble rouser in the theology class always. The history of women in the church. You mentioned something about, how women were active in the church in the very beginning. And I wonder if the fact that they weren't allowed to do things as the men gained power in the church and it became more patriarchal, is that more political than theological?
I think in many cases it was, but I think in some ways it shows the creativity of some of these women, because they worked in the structures they had. I think for somebody like St. Clair, for example, living in the 1200s, the idea that she wanted to go out and be one of the guys, she kind of knew that wouldn't happen in those days, but she creatively worked with being cloistered and tried to work around the system, you might say. And unfortunately, that's what women sometimes had to do, I think. I'm not sure that men or women were conscious of what we would call patriarchy. It just was the way things were. And the comparison I make, I lived in Louisiana for a while, and I was talking to some friends of mine about the period before the civil rights movement, when you went on the bus and black people had to move to the back. And I said, well, did you think that was wrong? And they said, well, the problem was we didn't think about it. It just was the way things were when we were growing up. And then you realize that was horrible, but we didn't realize it until something brought it to our attention. And I think that happens periodically with the church. I think one of the good points of Catholicism is, whereas Protestants would get arguing about what the scripture means and it's split into denominations, Catholics, I think, did away with some of that by splitting into religious orders and spiritualities. So you become a Franciscan or a Dominican, or you become a sister, or you become a priest. Or that doesn't answer your question really, but I think that that whole thing is something that we're only really looking at in recent decades. And I'll give you an example. When I joined the order, the Franciscan order, there was a big emphasis on St. Clare. She was seen as the co-founder of the order. We'd read her writings. We studied Clare. The older people in Franciscan order, including the women, really didn't know anything about her. I went on a pilgrimage to Assisi, and one of the sisters said, "I'm learning so much." And I said, "Like what?" And she said, "I didn't know St. Clare had anything to do with Franciscans." And I thought, for us, we were raised with the idea that she's like the founder. And now all of a sudden people are paying attention to women in a new way. So, and I think when we talk about the 19th century, you see women starting to move out of the cloister and doing active ministry in ways they'd never been able to before, and becoming the backbone of the church in many cases. But I think the awareness is an issue that's separate in that it came and went over the centuries.
Well, thank you. I lived in a former cloister monastery when I went to Maria College. So that was a unique, very unique experience. But I'm also a Mercy associate, and Catherine Macaulay started the Sisters of Mercy were called the Walking Sisters in Ireland.
Yeah, the sushi pay was the prayer, right?
Yeah, yes. And I was raised by Augustinians and did not know until I took theology class in college that St. Augustine was not always very saintly, you know?
Well,
they never told us that.
I think that's true. And I also think in terms of religious orders, in the old days, people just joined whatever group was near them. And particularly the men, they wanted to be priests, and they only were in a Franciscan parish, so they became Franciscans. They didn't have a clue what that meant sometimes. It was just a way to become a priest. Mm-hmm. And now they have to think about it. Do I want to be a Franciscan, or do I want to be a Dawson priest? Do I want to be a sister? Do I want to be a cloistered nun? Do I want to be a lay woman? What do I want to be? And I think people are more conscious of what they're choosing, where before it was kind of generic. You'd have a group there's one group was called the Sisters of St. Francis of St. Joseph of the Third Order, or something like that. You know, what are they about? And I'm sure they didn't even know, maybe in some cases.
Well, thank you.
Any other?
Yeah. Sorry, I can't do justice to the big topic. It's important.
Any other questions or comments?
I would just like to make one comment. When I was in elementary school, and I'm at least as old as you, or older than you, Father, I learned that St. Clare helped found the order.
Well, your teachers were ahead of the times. Were they Franciscan sisters by chance?
Sisters of Mercy at VI.
Well, congratulations to them.
Anything else? Well, we have one more session left. We'll take our time from Vatican I to today. So
we'll have fewer centuries
years to go.
Fewer centuries to cover. That'll help a little bit.
A little shorter, but
you're more familiar
people
with.
that we probably know a lot more about. So we will meet again next Thursday at 7:30 to complete the history and thank Father Dan for his continued help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Again, I apologize for